Monica Wilson, a striking black woman, gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the quiet streets of Millbrook. The small town appeared frozen in time with its charming facades and tree-lined sidewalks, but for Monica, everything had changed. Her dark eyes scanned the road ahead, barely absorbing the peaceful surroundings. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't untangle. After all these years, she was finally going to see her father again. David Wilson, the man who had been absent for most of her life, not by choice, but because of a terrible mistake. "He's free now," Monica whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the car's hum. The words felt foreign, as if she was still trying to convince herself they were true. A wave of relief washed over her, only to be replaced by a surge of anger that made her jaw tighten. All those lost years, all the milestones her father had missed. Her high school graduation, her first heartbreak, her struggles to survive. The injustice of it all made her blood boil. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. She took a deep breath, trying to quell the storm brewing inside her. It wasn't fair to blame her father, she knew that. But the hurt and resentment that had built up over the years weren't easy to let go of. As she passed a small park, Monica caught sight of a father pushing his little girl on a swing. The image hit her like a punch to the gut. That could have been us, she thought, blinking rapidly to keep the tears at bay. Her car slowed as she approached the address she had scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. It was a modest house with peeling paint and an overgrown garden. This was where her father had been staying since his release. Monica parked the car but didn't move, her heart pounding in her chest. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, summoning courage. But as she reached for the door handle, her hand faltered. What would she say to him after all this time? How could she bridge the gap that years of separation had carved between them? With a shaky breath, Monica stepped out of the car, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. Each step along the cracked concrete path felt like a journey through time, bringing her closer to a reunion she both longed for and feared. She froze on the doorstep, her hand hovering inches from the doorbell. Her mind raced with memories, each one a painful reminder of the life she and her father had lost. She remembered the day the police came to their house. She was just a little girl, confused and scared as they took her father away. The image of her mother collapsing to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, was seared into her memory forever. After everything changed, her mother, Sarah, had to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. Monica grew up fast, learning to cook, clean, and take care of herself while her mother was away. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, wishing her father was there to tuck her in and tell her everything would be okay. As she got older, the visits to the prison became less frequent. It hurt too much to see him behind that glass, his eyes filled with sadness and regret. Monica built walls around her heart, trying to shield herself from the pain, but the anger and resentment festered, like an open wound refusing to heal. Now, standing on the threshold of reuniting with her father, Monica felt a storm of emotions threaten to overwhelm her. Part of her wanted to run back to her car and drive away, to protect herself from more heartache. But another part, a small voice deep inside, yearned to see her father's face again, to hear his voice without the crackle of a prison phone line. Taking a deep breath, Monica stepped back from the door. She needed more time. She wasn't ready for this confrontation yet. Her feet carried her back to her car, and soon she was driving again aimlessly, with no real destination in mind. As she turned a corner, her heart skipped a beat. She saw flashing lights and orange cones, forming a random police checkpoint. Her palms began to sweat as she gripped the wheel tighter. Even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, years of distrust toward the police made her stomach churn with unease. Monica slowed the car, merging into the line of vehicles waiting to pass through the checkpoint. She watched as the officers spoke with each driver, their faces serious and focused. With each car that moved forward, Monica's anxiety grew. As her turn approached, her heart pounded in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. Finally, it was her turn. A tall officer with graying temples approached her window. His badge read Officer John Harrison. His face was stern but not unkind. "License and registration, please," he said in a firm yet polite voice. Monica's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse. She fumbled with the zipper, her anxiety making her fingers clumsy. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to pull out her wallet and retrieve her license. She then leaned over to the glove compartment for her registration. "Here you go, officer," Monica said, handing over the documents. Officer Harrison took them with a nod. He glanced at her license, then back at Monica. Suddenly, his whole demeanor shifted. His eyes widened slightly and his body stiffened. The change was subtle, but Monica noticed it immediately. A cold sensation settled in the pit of her stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Officer Harrison's eyes flicked between the license and Monica's face several times, his brow furrowed as if he were struggling with something internally. Monica's palms began to sweat again. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. "Is everything all right, officer?" Monica finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Harrison didn't respond right away. He looked at Monica again, this time with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Surprise? Fear? Whatever it was, it sent Monica's anxiety into overdrive. The air in the car felt thick and heavy and she found it hard to breathe. She wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but fear kept her silent. What could be causing this reaction? Had she done something wrong? Was there an issue with her license? As the tension mounted, Monica felt like she was balancing on a razor's edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Whatever was about to happen, she knew it would change everything. Officer Harrison stepped away from Monica's car, motioning for another officer to join him. The two men huddled a short distance away, their voices low and urgent. Monica strained to hear what they were saying, but their words were drowned out by the hum of passing traffic. Her heart raced as she watched them, trying to read their body language. Officer Harrison's shoulders were tense, his hands moving in quick, sharp gestures as he spoke. The other officer nodded, his brow furrowed with concern. Monica's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. What could they be talking about? Why did her name seem to cause such a stir? She thought about her father, about his wrongful conviction, and a cold fear gripped her heart. Could this have something to do with him? Minutes passed, feeling like hours to Monica. She glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing a line of cars forming behind her. The other drivers seemed impatient, some craning their necks to see what was causing the holdup. Officer Harrison and his colleague continued their hushed conversation. At one point, the other officer shook his head firmly, as if disagreeing with something Harrison had said. Harrison ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated and conflicted. Monica's mouth was dry. She wished she could hear what they were saying, but at the same time, she was terrified of what she might learn. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers seemed to come to a decision. Both nodded, their faces serious. Monica's heart skipped a beat as she saw them turn and begin walking back toward her car. She sat up straighter, trying to appear calm and in control, but inside, her emotions were in turmoil. What were they going to say? What had they decided? The uncertainty was killing her. As the officers approached, Monica took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was to come. Officer Harrison walked toward her car, his face a mask of strained composure. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice firm but tinged with tension. Monica's heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with questions and fears. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. As she stepped out onto the scorching asphalt, the afternoon sun bore down on her, sweat trickling down her forehead. She wasn't sure if it was from the heat or her growing anxiety. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the panic that surged within her. Officer Harrison avoided her gaze. "Look, we just need to conduct a more thorough search of your vehicle, ma'am. It's standard procedure." Monica watched in disbelief as another officer began rifling through her car. He opened the trunk, rummaged through her bags, and even checked beneath the seats. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating as the search dragged on. Monica's mind spun with possibilities. Was this about her father? Had something happened that she didn't know about? The uncertainty gnawed at her, almost unbearable. The distant sound of honking cars barely registered in her mind. All she could focus on was the officers meticulously going through her belongings. Officer Harrison stood nearby, his posture rigid and uncomfortable. He glanced at Monica, then quickly looked away as if unable to meet her eyes. The search felt like it was stretching on forever. Monica's legs weakened and she leaned against the car for support. She wanted to demand answers, to know why this was happening, but fear kept her silent. When the other officer finally emerged from the car, Monica held her breath. What had they found? What was going to happen next? The moment stretched out, tense like a rubber band about to snap. Officer Harrison exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. He turned to face Monica, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. "Miss Wilson," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Monica's heart raced as she watched the officer struggle with his words. Whatever he was about to say, she knew it would change everything. I was the officer who arrested your father all those years ago, Harrison finally confessed, his words hanging heavily in the air between them. Monica felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her mind whirled, trying to process the shocking revelation. She stared at Officer Harrison, her eyes wide with disbelief and a rising fury. You, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're the one. Memories flooded her mind. The night her father was taken away, her mother's tears, the years of struggle and loneliness. All because of the man standing in front of her. A wave of anger surged through Monica, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, her entire body trembling with emotion. Do you have any idea what you did to us? She demanded, her voice rising. My father lost years of his life. Our family was torn apart. Officer Harrison flinched at her words, his face etched with remorse. I'm sorry, he said softly. I made a terrible mistake and I've regretted it every day since. But Monica wasn't ready to hear his apologies. The pain of the past was too raw, too fresh in her mind. Sorry, she spat. Sorry doesn't give us back those years. Sorry doesn't fix what you broke. Tears welled in Monica's eyes, a storm of anger and long-repressed sorrow swirling inside her. She felt betrayed, not just by Officer Harrison, but by the entire system that had failed her family so spectacularly. As Monica stood there, shaking with emotion, Officer Harrison looked utterly defeated. The weight of his past actions seemed to press down on him physically, making him appear smaller, older than he had just moments ago. Monica's rage erupted like a volcano, her words spilling out in a torrent of pain and accusation. You ruined our lives, she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father? My mother worked herself to the bone just to put food on the table. Officer Harrison stood there, his face a mask of anguish. He didn't try to defend himself or interrupt Monica's outburst. Instead, he seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. His shoulders slumped and unshed tears glistened in his eyes. I was just a little girl, Monica continued, her voice softer now but no less intense. I needed my father and you took him away from me, from us. All those birthdays, school events, holidays, gone. And for what? A mistake. Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Miss Wilson, I can't even begin to express how sorry I am. I've carried this guilt with me every day for years. Monica scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. Guilt? You think feeling guilty makes up for what we went through? No, Harrison admitted, shaking his head. Nothing can make up for the pain I caused your family. But I want you to know that I've been haunted by my mistake. I've questioned every decision, every arrest I've made since then. I've tried to be a better officer, a better person. He took a deep breath before continuing. I've wanted to apologize for so long, but I was scared. Scared of facing the consequences of my actions. Scared of confronting the pain I caused. But seeing you here today, I knew I couldn't let this opportunity pass. Monica stared at him, her anger still simmering but now mingled with confusion. She hadn't expected this raw honesty, this open display of regret. It didn't erase the years of pain, but it made her pause, made her see the man behind the badge for the first time. As she stood there, her chest heaving with emotions she couldn't name, Officer Harrison's words hung in the air between them, heavy with sorrow and regret. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to let it shield her from the pain that threatened to consume her. But as she looked at Harrison's face, etched with guilt and remorse, she felt her resolve begin to crack. You can't just apologize and expect everything to be okay, Monica said, her voice trembling. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep? How many times I had to explain to my friends why my dad wasn't at school events? Harrison nodded, his eyes never leaving Monica's face. I can't imagine the pain you've been through. I know my words can't undo the damage I caused. But I want you to know that I've spent every day since then trying to be better. To make sure something like this never happens again. Monica shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Why now? Why didn't you come forward sooner? I was a coward, Harrison admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I was scared of losing my job and facing the consequences, but the guilt was eating me alive. I've been trying to find a way to make amends, to somehow right this wrong. Monica felt her emotions swirling like a storm inside her. Part of her wanted to forgive, to let go of the anger that had been her constant companion for so long. But another part of her, the hurt child who grew up without a father, clung to that anger as if it were a lifeline. I don't know if I can forgive you, Monica finally said, her voice thick with unshed tears. I don't know if I ever will. Harrison nodded, accepting her words with a sad resignation. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness, Miss Wilson. I just needed you to know how sorry I am for what happened to your family because of my mistake. Monica turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. She felt drained, exhausted by the sudden onslaught of emotions. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion, sadness, and a small flicker of something she wasn't ready to name. She climbed back into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She couldn't bring herself to look at Officer Harrison as she drove away from the checkpoint. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, and each memory that surfaced only fueled her anger and resentment. As she drove down the quiet country road, images from her past flooded her thoughts. She remembered the day the police came to her house, how her mother broke down in tears when they took her father away. Monica had been just a little girl back then, confused and scared, not understanding why her father was being handcuffed. The years that followed were a blur of struggle and hardship. She recalled her mother working multiple jobs, coming home late with dark circles under her eyes. Monica had learned to cook and clean at an age when most children were still playing with dolls. She had to grow up fast, taking on responsibilities no child should have to bear. Tears blurred her vision as she remembered the first time she visited her father in prison. The cold, sterile visitation room, the guards watching their every move, and the way her father's eyes filled with tears when he saw how much she had grown. It was like looking at a stranger, not the loving father who used to swing her around and call her his little princess. School had been its own kind of torture. The whispers, the sideways glances, the way some parents wouldn't let their children play with her anymore. You don't want to hang around the daughter of a criminal, she had overheard one mother say. The words had cut deep, leaving scars that never fully healed. As Monica gripped the steering wheel tighter, Harrison's apology echoed in her mind, but it felt hollow in the face of everything they had lost. How could a simple, "I'm sorry," make up for the birthdays her father missed, the graduations he couldn't attend, the countless moments that should have been filled with family but were marked by his absence? The injustice of it all burned in her chest. One man's mistake had cost them everything, and now, years later, he thought he could just apologize and make it all better? Monica shook her head, anger and hurt boiling inside her. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Monica's car came to a stop in front of a small, worn-down house. The peeling paint and overgrown lawn spoke of years of neglect. This was her father's new home, so different from the tidy suburban house of her childhood memories. She sat in the car for a long moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. The encounter with Officer Harrison had left her raw and vulnerable. All the anger and pain she had suppressed for years was bubbling to the surface, making her question if she was ready to face her father. Taking a deep breath, Monica finally stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under her feet as she walked up to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached the door and froze. The faded welcome mat beneath her feet felt like a mockery. After all these years, after everything they had been through, how could anything about this feel welcoming? She raised her hand to knock but hesitated, trembling. The emotions from her encounter with Officer Harrison were still swirling inside her. Anger at the injustice, pain from the memories, and a confusing mix of resentment and longing for the father she had lost. Monica stared at the chipped paint on the door, her mind racing. What would she say to him? How could she look him in the eye without seeing all the birthdays, graduations, and everyday moments he had missed? The weight of their shared history pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She lowered her hand, then raised it again, trapped in an endless loop of indecision. The desire to see her father warring with the fear of reopening old wounds. She wasn't the little girl he had left behind anymore. She had grown, hardened by life's challenges. Would he even recognize the woman she had become? Monica stood there, her hands suspended in the air, torn between knocking and walking away. The moment stretched, filled with all the unspoken words and repressed emotions of the past years. Suddenly, the door opened, revealing her father, David Wilson. His eyes widened as he saw Monica standing there, his face a mixture of emotions. For a moment, both of them froze, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Monica, my daughter," David said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're here." Monica nodded, unable to find her voice. She saw her father, older, grayer, but still unmistakably the man she remembered from her childhood. "Please come in," David said, stepping back to make room. Monica hesitated for a second before crossing the threshold. The living room was sparsely furnished with a worn couch and a small TV in the corner. The walls were bare, except for a single framed picture of Monica as a child. "Can I get you something to drink?" David asked, his hands fidgeting nervously. "No, thank you," Monica replied, her voice barely a whisper. In the days that followed, Monica and David slowly began to rebuild their relationship. They spent time cooking meals together, watching old movies, and taking short walks around the neighborhood. At first, their conversations were awkward and stilted, but as time passed, they found themselves opening up more. One evening, while sitting on the porch watching the sunset, David turned to Monica, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you all those years." Monica felt tears prick at her eyes. "Dad, it wasn't your fault. You were wrongfully convicted." "I know," David admitted, "but I still feel like I let you down. I missed so much of your life." As they talked, Monica found herself sharing her own struggles. The loneliness, the anger, the feeling of abandonment. David listened, his eyes filled with understanding and regret. During those conversations, Monica began to see her father in a new light. She realized that while she had been carrying her own pain, he had been bearing an even heavier burden. This passage follows Monica and her father, David, as they navigate difficult emotions related to forgiveness, particularly toward Officer Harrison, the policeman who wronged their family. As they share a breakfast and visit places filled with memories, David opens up about his evolving thoughts on forgiveness, despite years of anger and resentment. David reveals that he's been contemplating forgiving Officer Harrison, not for the officer's sake, but for his own peace of mind. This shocks Monica, who still holds on to the intense anger and pain from their past, unable to comprehend how her father could even consider such an idea. She questions him, expressing disbelief and frustration, unable to see how forgiving someone who had caused so much harm could lead to healing. David patiently explains that holding on to anger only continues to hurt them and keep them stuck in the past, likening it to carrying a heavy burden. He emphasizes that forgiveness isn't about excusing Harrison's actions, but about freeing themselves from the emotional prison that anger creates. Monica struggles to accept this perspective, admitting that she's been angry for so long that she doesn't know how to let go. Her father acknowledges that the journey is difficult and doesn't happen overnight. He offers support, telling her that they will face it together, encouraging her to at least consider the idea of forgiveness as a step toward healing. In this emotional and introspective scene, the themes of forgiveness, healing, and the complexities of moving on from trauma are explored. David's journey toward forgiveness stands in contrast to Monica's ongoing struggle, but the conversation marks a turning point for her as she begins to contemplate a different way of coping with the pain that has shaped her life for so long. As they sat on the park bench, the notion of forgiveness no longer seemed impossible, just achingly, excruciatingly difficult. Monica lingered on the bench long after her father had gone inside to rest. The afternoon sun warmed her face, but inside she felt a chill and turmoil. Her father's words about forgiveness reverberated in her mind, stirring a maelstrom of emotions. As she watched people strolling, laughing, and enjoying the day, Monica realized how long it had been since she had felt truly happy. The anger she had harbored for years had become a constant companion, coloring every aspect of her life. She reflected on her work at the local community center, recalling how she had yelled at a colleague last week over a minor mistake. The hurt in her coworker's eyes haunted her memory, making her shrink with guilt. Her anger towards the past had caused her to judge others harshly. Her thoughts drifted to her last failed relationship, where she had always blamed her ex for not bearing her pain. Now, she questioned if her own inability to let go had driven him away. How many connections had she lost due to the wall she had built around herself? Monica closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her resentment pressing down on her. It was exhausting to be perpetually angry, always on guard, ready to fight against perceived injustices. Opening her eyes, she saw a young girl chasing bubbles, her laughter echoing through the park. Monica couldn't remember the last time she had laughed with such pure, unrestrained joy. Her anger had stolen those moments from her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Monica felt a shift within her. Perhaps her father was right. Holding on to this anger wasn't punishing Officer Harrison or the system that had wronged them. Maybe it was only punishing herself. The thought of forgiveness still terrified her. It felt like letting go of a part of herself that had defined her for so long. But as she observed the world around her, vibrant and full of possibilities, Monica began to wonder what her life could be like without the heavy burden of resentment. Monica rose from the bench, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. She needed to move to clear her head. Without a clear destination, she started walking through the city, her footsteps echoing in the quiet streets. Turning a corner, she nearly bumped into an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. Without thinking, Monica reached out to steady her. "Oh, thank you, dear," the woman said, her wrinkled face lighting up with a warm smile. Would you mind helping me across the street? Monica hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As they crossed together, the woman chatted about her grandchildren, her voice filled with love. Monica found herself smiling despite the turmoil inside. Further down the street, she passed a small cafe where a young man held the door open for customers, greeting each with a cheerful, "Have a great day." His kindness to strangers touched something deep in Monica's heart. As she continued her walk, she noticed more and more small acts of kindness around her. A child sharing ice cream with a friend, a shopkeeper giving directions to a lost tourist, a teenager helping a mother with her stroller onto a bus. These simple gestures of human kindness began to chip away at the hard shell Monica had built around her heart. She realized the world wasn't filled only with injustice and pain. There was goodness often found in the smallest actions. Watching a group of friends laughing together in a park, Monica felt a sudden pang of longing. How long had it been since she allowed herself to connect with others like that? Her anger had kept people at a distance, protecting her but also isolating her. For the first time, Monica began to understand what her father meant about forgiveness. It wasn't about condoning what Officer Harrison had done or forgetting the pain they had endured. It was about freeing herself from the chains of the past and allowing herself to see and experience the goodness in the world again. Returning to her father's house, Monica's steps were lighter than when she had left. The walk through the city had given her a new perspective, filling her with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. When she entered the living room, she found David in his favorite armchair, reading a book. "Dad," Monica said softly, drawing David's attention. "I think I'm ready to talk about forgiveness." David's eyes widened slightly and he set his book aside. "That's wonderful, Monica. Come sit." Monica settled onto the sofa opposite her father, taking a deep breath as she tried to find the right words. "I'm not saying it will be easy, but I want to try. I want to forgive Officer Harrison." David's eyes shone with pride and understanding. "That's a big step, sweetheart. I'm proud of you for even considering it." Monica continued, her voice wavering slightly. "The thing is, I'm not sure how to do it. It seems so overwhelming." David leaned forward, his expression softening. "It's okay to feel that way. Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process." Monica nodded, twisting her hands in her lap. "I know, but where do I start?" David was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if we reach out to Officer Harrison together? We could invite him here or meet him in a neutral place. Sometimes facing the person you need to forgive can be a powerful first step." Monica felt a twinge of anxiety at the thought of seeing Officer Harrison again, but beneath that anxiety was a flicker of hope. "Will you do it with me?" she asked. "Of course," David replied without hesitation. "We're in this together, Monica. You don't have to face it alone." Tears welled up in Monica's eyes. For so long she had carried her anger and pain alone. The thought of having her father's support touched her deeply. "Okay," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Let's do it. Let's reach out to Officer Harrison." David extended his hand and Monica took it, feeling a mix of apprehension and hope. "I'm so proud of you, Monica. This is a big step, but I believe it will lead us all toward healing." Monica squeezed his hand, feeling a blend of fear and hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years she felt ready to face it. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number. David sat beside her, offering silent support. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Officer Harrison speaking." Monica took a deep breath. "Officer Harrison, this is Monica Wilson. We'd like to meet with you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Monica, of course, are you sure?" "Yes," Monica said, her voice firm now. "My father and I would like to talk with you, perhaps at the park near Main Street." "I'll be there," Officer Harrison replied, his voice a mix of surprise and relief. When Monica hung up, she felt a whirlwind of emotions. Her stomach churned with nervousness, and a spark of anger still flickered in her chest. But there was something else too, a small glimmer of hope that perhaps this meeting could be the first step toward healing. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did great, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Monica sighed, leaning into her father's touch. "Scared, angry, hopeful. I don't know, everything's mixed up inside me." "It's okay to feel conflicted," David reassured her. "What matters is that you're taking this step." As the day of the meeting approached, Monica felt a growing intensity in her emotions. She found herself pacing back and forth in her father's living room, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say to Officer Harrison. "What if I can't do this?" she wondered aloud the night before. "What if I see him and all I feel is anger?" David pulled her into a comforting embrace. "That's okay," he said gently. Forgiveness isn't about forcing yourself to feel something. It's about opening the door to the possibility. No matter what happens, I'll be right here with you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as Monica and David approached the bench where Officer Harrison was waiting. The officer rose to greet them, his hands nervously clasped at his sides. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Monica's heart raced as she faced the man who had so profoundly altered their lives. She was overwhelmed by a surge of anger, but beneath it, there was also a sharp pang of something else, perhaps pity. They all took their seats and the tension was palpable, as thick as the summer air. Monica's gaze fell on her hands, tightly clasped in her lap. Officer Harrison glanced between David and Monica, his face etched with a mix of shame and anxiety. For what seemed like an eternity, the only sounds were the distant laughter of children playing and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice steady and resolute. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," he said. "I know this can't be easy for you too." Officer Harrison nodded, swallowing hard. "I've wanted to apologize for so long," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "But I never knew where to start." Monica looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. She saw the deep remorse and pain etched into his face, and something inside her softened. David placed a reassuring hand on Monica's arm. "We're here now," he said, looking from his daughter to the officer. "That's what matters. This is our chance to begin healing." Monica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that whatever happened next would shape their futures. Drawing strength from her father's encouragement, she found her voice. "I've been so angry for so long," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here because I want to understand. I want to know why." Officer Harrison took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. "I want to apologize again," he said, his voice shaking. "What I did was unforgivable, but I hope you'll let me explain." Monica nodded, her gaze fixed on the officer. She noticed the deep lines around his eyes and mouth, signs of years of stress and regret. "Back then, I was a young officer eager to prove myself," Harrison continued. "There was so much pressure to close cases quickly. When the evidence seemed to point to your father, I rushed to judgment." David gently squeezed Monica's hand, encouraging her to listen. She felt a swirl of emotions but remained silent, allowing Harrison to speak. "I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing," Harrison said, his voice almost a whisper. "But deep down I knew something wasn't right. I ignored that feeling and it haunts me every day." As Harrison spoke, Monica listened intently. For the first time, she saw the man not as a faceless antagonist but as a flawed human being, burdened by his actions. Tears began to well in her eyes as she heard him express his sorrow. "I've thought about your family every day," Harrison continued, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I've imagined your birthdays, your holidays, moments stolen because of my mistake. I know I can't give that time back, but I want you to know how truly sorry I am." A lump formed in Monica's throat. The anger that had fueled her for so long began to give way to something else, a glimpse of understanding. "I've spent years trying to make amends," Harrison said. "I've advocated for better training and talked to young officers about the importance of trusting their instincts. But I know none of that changes what happened to your family." As Harrison's words sank in, Monica felt a shift within herself. The man before her was not the faceless villain she had imagined but a person weighed down by remorse. David cleared his throat, meeting Harrison's gaze with a steely resolve. The park seemed to hold its breath as if nature itself was pausing to listen. "Officer Harrison," David began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I want you to understand what your actions cost me." Monica tensed, bracing for her father's wrath, but his words, though heavy with pain, carried no bitterness. "I lost years of my life," he continued. "Years I can never get back. I missed watching my daughter grow up, holding my wife's hand as she fought cancer. I lost my freedom, my dignity, and almost my hope." Harrison's face crumpled with shame, but David was not finished. "In prison, my anger became another set of bars around me, even after I learned the truth about my innocence." Monica's eyes filled with tears. She had never heard her father speak so openly about his suffering before. David took a deep breath, his next words shocking Monica and Harrison alike. "But Officer Harrison," he said, "I want you to know that I forgive you." The words hung in the air, almost unbelievable. Monica's mouth fell open in surprise and Harrison looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad," Monica whispered, confusion evident in her voice. David reached out, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I've learned something important," he said. Holding on to anger and hatred made me a prisoner in a different way. It kept me from truly living and moving forward. He turned to Harrison, who sat frozen, barely breathing. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, David explained gently. It's about freeing myself. It's the only way I can truly be free and start living again. Monica sat in stunned silence, her father's words echoing in her mind. She looked at David, seeing him in a new light. The man before her was not broken by his years in prison but strengthened by them. His ability to forgive seemed almost superhuman to her. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her father reach out to Officer Harrison. A simple yet profound gesture of strength she hadn't known he possessed. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "how can you forgive so easily?" David turned to his daughter, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and peace. "It's not easy, Monica," he said. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But holding on to anger was killing me from the inside out." Monica nodded, understanding. As the dawn's light touched her face, she looked at Officer Harrison, who sat with his head bowed, overwhelmed by David's forgiveness. In that moment, something shifted within Monica. The anger that had been her constant companion began to loosen its grip. She saw Officer Harrison not as an enemy but as a flawed human who had made a grave mistake. Taking a deep breath, Monica spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "Officer Harrison," she began, "what you did caused us so much pain. But I see now that holding on to that pain doesn't help anyone, not even me." She paused, gathering her courage. "I forgive you too. It may take time for me to fully heal, but I want to try." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Monica felt a glimmer of hope and release. The Officer Harrison looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am deeply grateful." Monica felt a profound relief lift from her shoulders. She realized that her father's strength wasn't in his ability to endure hardships but in his capacity to let go and move forward. His example gave her the courage to do the same. As they sat together in the park, the air seemed lighter. Monica understood that forgiveness wasn't a magical fix. There was still a long road ahead. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt hope blossoming in her heart. The three of them sat in silence, the weight of forgiveness hanging in the air, almost tangible in its intensity. Officer Harrison's shoulders shook with silent sobs, overwhelmed by the grace he had been shown. "I don't know what to say," he stammered, wiping his eyes with trembling hands. "Your forgiveness means more than I can express." David placed a comforting hand on Harrison's shoulder. "It's a new beginning for all of us," he said softly. Monica watched this exchange, feeling a whirl of emotions inside her. The anger that had been her constant companion for so long was slowly ebbing away, replaced by a peace she hadn't known in years. Officer Harrison took a deep breath, regaining his composure. He looked at David and Monica with a determined gaze. "I promise both of you," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I will spend every day of the rest of my life working to ensure that no one else suffers the way you did. Your story, your forgiveness, it will drive me to be better, to do better." Monica felt something shift within her with his words. The weight she had carried for so long, the burden of anger and resentment, began to lift. It was as if a dam had broken, allowing years of repressed emotion to flow out of her. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she was finally letting go. The release was both painful and liberating, like setting down a heavy load she had carried for far too long. "I feel lighter," Monica whispered, almost to herself. She looked at her father, then at Officer Harrison, a small smile forming on her lips. "I didn't realize how much energy it took to stay angry." David wrapped an arm around his daughter, pulling her close. "It takes a lot of strength to forgive, Monica. I'm so proud of you." As they sat together, the sun peeking through the trees, Monica felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead might still be long and challenging, but for the first time she felt ready to face it, not with anger but with understanding and the power of forgiveness. The three of them walked together to a nearby restaurant, their steps lighter than before. The small bell above the door jingled as they entered, drawing a few curious glances from other diners. They settled into a cozy booth by the window, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the table. As they perused the menus, the initial awkwardness began to fade. Officer Harrison cleared his throat and asked tentatively, "So, David, what's the first thing you did when you got out?" David chuckled softly. "Believe it or not, I went straight to the park and sat on a bench for hours just watching people and feeling the breeze. It was overwhelming, in the best way." Monica listened intently, realizing there was much about her father's experience she didn't know. She felt a pang of regret for the time they had lost but was quickly overwhelmed with gratitude for this moment of connection. The waitress came to take their order, and as she left, Harrison shared a story from his early days as a rookie cop. "I was so nervous on my first traffic stop that I forgot to ask for the driver's license. I just stood there stammering about speed limits," he said with a sheepish grin. Monica burst into laughter, the sound bright and genuine, filling the restaurant with warmth. David joined in, his deep laughter mingling with Monica's as they enjoyed the unexpected humor. As the food arrived, the conversation flowed more easily. They shared stories of their lives, finding common ground in unexpected places. Harrison spoke about his children, and David shared positive experiences from prison, like teaching other inmates to read. Monica opened up too, discussing her work and dreams for the future. She realized how long it had been since she allowed herself to be truly vulnerable with someone. The atmosphere around the table was now filled with a sense of mutual respect and peace. Laughter came more frequently, and the silences were comforting rather than tense. It was as if the act of forgiveness had opened a door, allowing them to see each other as whole people, not just defined by their past roles in each other's lives. As they finished their meals, Monica found herself lost in thought. She gazed out the restaurant window, watching people pass by, each with their own stories and struggles. The weight that had pressed on her chest for years seemed to have lifted, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She turned to look at her father and Officer Harrison, who were engaged in a friendly debate about the best fishing spots in the area. A small smile played on her lips as she marveled at the scene before her. Just a few hours earlier, she couldn't have imagined sitting at the same table with these two men, let alone enjoying their company. As she watched her father's face, she noticed the lines of worry that had softened since their meeting in the park. She felt a warm wave of affection, realizing how much closer she felt to him now. The years of distance and resentment seemed to melt away, replaced by a newfound understanding and connection. As Officer Harrison shared a funny anecdote, making David laugh heartily, Monica felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The anger that had been her constant companion for so long was dissipating, making room for something new, hope, perhaps, or the possibility of a better future. By choosing forgiveness, she had not only freed her father and Officer Harrison from the burden of the past but also released the resentment that had colored her world for so long. It was dissipating, allowing her to see things in a new light. Monica felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring within her. She began to envision the possibilities ahead, no longer constrained by the chains of her anger. She could focus on rebuilding her relationship with her father, pursuing her dreams, and perhaps even making a difference in her community. As the conversation continued around her, Monica silently thanked whatever force had brought her to this moment. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years she felt ready to face it with an open heart and a lighter spirit. As the evening drew to a close, Monica, David, and Officer Harrison stood up from their table. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension that had marked their previous meetings. They walked outside, where the setting sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Officer Harrison turned to face Monica and David, his eyes filled with gratitude and a newfound sense of purpose. "I can't thank you both enough for giving me this chance," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I want you to know that I meant every word I said. I will do everything in my power to ensure that what happened to you, David, never happens to anyone else." David smiled gently. "That's all we can ask, John. Use your experience to make a difference." Monica watched the exchange, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The anger that had fueled her for so long had evaporated, replaced by a quiet understanding. She realized that this moment marked the end of a painful chapter in her life and the beginning of something new. "Officer Harrison," Monica said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice, "thank you for meeting with us today. I know it wasn't easy, but it means a lot that you were willing to face us and take responsibility." Harrison nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's the least I could do. And please call me John. I hope that someday we might even become friends." As they said their goodbyes, Monica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She watched as Officer Harrison walked away, his steps seeming lighter than before. She knew their paths would likely cross again in this small town, but now instead of fear she felt a glimmer of hope. Turning to her father, Monica saw her own emotions mirrored in his eyes. They had both taken a significant step forward that day, not only by forgiving Officer Harrison but also by healing their own relationship. As they walked back to David's home, Monica felt a sense of closure envelop her. The chapter of her life defined by anger and resentment was ending, making way for a new beginning filled with possibilities and renewed connections. Monica and David returned to their modest home in companionable silence. The weight of years of pain and misunderstanding had finally been lifted from their shoulders. Once inside, a sense of peace settled over them. They made their way to the living room, where David gestured for Monica to sit on the worn but comfortable sofa. He took his place in his favorite armchair, and for a moment, they simply gazed at each other, marveling at how much had changed in a single day. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," David said softly, breaking the silence. "It's like I can breathe better now." Monica nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Me too, Dad. I've carried so much anger for so long. I didn't realize how heavy it was until I let it go." David leaned forward, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's not just about forgiving Officer Harrison. It's also about giving ourselves permission to move on, to heal." Monica sighed, feeling the truth in his words. "Yes, it's like we've been stuck in this loop of pain and anger. But today it feels like we're finally free." David reached out and took Monica's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you, Monica. You've shown such strength and grace." She looked at her father, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." They sat together for a while longer, reflecting on the day's events and the changes they had undergone. As the evening grew darker, Monica felt a renewed sense of purpose and a glimmer of hope for the future. The road ahead might still be challenging, but she was ready to face it with an open heart and a lighter spirit. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.